Alright guys, so welcome to our next asynchronous lesson for U.S. history for October. Today we're covering the Debating Democracy and Constitutional Convention lessons in our textbook, part of it at least, and I'm Mrs. Richardson, your instructor. Alright, so we talked about the beginning of the foundations of the U.S. government after the Revolutionary War, and we're going to continue talking about that today. So we're going to look at state constitutions, articles of confederation, and we're actually going to skip this section for today. So there is a video right in our content for the Articles of Confederation. So you may not know this, but the Articles of Confederation were actually the first constitution that the United States adopted. So sort of this, national constitution for governmental law. But it didn't last. It was enforced from March 1st, 1781 until 1789, when the present-day Constitution went into effect. So it was only there for about 8 years. It was the first attempt at a constitution, and there were some issues with it, and you'll learn about that in the video, and why we ended up with a different or updated constitution, which is the one that we still have in America today. So what is in the current U.S. Constitution? So there's a preamble, or sort of a running introduction, and then it's broken down into multiple articles, and then of course we also have amendments, things that were added to it later, and we'll talk about various amendments as we move forward through time. So Article 1, 2, and 3 cover the three main branches of government, which we're going to briefly discuss today. Article 4 talks about the states and the state rights. Article 5 is amendments, so how do you make changes or add to the U.S. Constitution legally. Article 6 talks about debts, supremacy oaths, and various categories or various topics that fall under those categories. And then Article 7 is about ratification, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. So first up are the three main branches of government, and you guys are probably familiar with these, but I'm still just going to do a brief review about them because we're learning about the period in time in which these were created. So this idea that a national government would have different branches, separate but equal, or the separation of these powers, was a pretty new concept during the time that the United States was being formed, baby America, as I call it. And the reason why early Americans set it up this way was they were trying to avoid a dictatorship or any of the qualities of a monarchy that they didn't want to turn around and have again ruling over them after just fighting a war to become their own country, to create their own government, to avoid a dictatorship. So the purpose of the separation of powers is that no one person or no one branch of the U.S. government has all of the power and could sort of, take over. So we have Article 1, which is the legislative branch. This is Congress. Congress makes the laws. Article 2 is the executive branch, which is the president and everyone under the president. The president enforces the laws. And Article 3, the judicial branch, or the courts, and the courts interpret the law. Okay, so this is the basic of how these are broken down. And then we have a system of what we call checks and balances. And what that means is each branch has some powers, and each branch also has the ability to curb the other branches if they start getting too much power. So Congress can write the law, confirm presidential appointment, ratify treaties. Congress can also overrule certain judicial decisions. They can impeach Supreme Court justices or reject Supreme Court judge appointments. So that's how they have control over curbing the power of the judicial branch. And you can see the examples go around, right? So these arrows going in both directions show you that each branch has some power over the others, with the idea that no one branch has all of the power. So that's the basic foundation of the U.S. government, and we'll talk about this more as we move forward. But during early America, this system was just getting put in place. And it was this balance between how do we give the national government enough power to run our country, but not so much power that they start taking over things and take away the rights of individuals and the rights of states. And that sort of this divide that led to two main groups, Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. And you may have heard of some of these people or may not, but these two groups formed out of the debates over whether or not to ratify the new Constitution, which includes the things we just talked about. Ratifying is basically approving, a formal process of voting and approving the Constitution. So this new Constitution was created, but it didn't take effect or become law until the states, or enough states, approved of or ratified it. And there were groups that argued, yes, we should ratify it, and groups that argued, no, we should not. So the Federalist groups included people like Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison. The Anti-Federalists included people like Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, George Mason, and also eventually Thomas Jefferson. And what did each group kind of believe? So the Federalist group advocated for a strong central or national government. They believed in national supremacy, that the federal government at the national level should be more powerful than the states. They were in favor of ratifying the Constitution. They did not believe a Bill of Rights was necessary. And there was this argument about whether or not to add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution as to protect individual rights further. The Anti-Federalists pretty much disagreed. They had the opposite belief. They were in favor of strong state governments. They believed that the state should be supreme. They were against ratifying the Constitution because they believed the Constitution gave the national government too much power. And they thought a Bill of Rights was essential to guaranteeing the rights of individual citizens. So, for those of you who are familiar with Hamilton, the Federalists, including Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison, wrote a series of essays to convince the citizens of the state of New York to vote to ratify the Constitution. They were successful in convincing the Anti-Federalist groups to ratify the Constitution with the promise that they would later include a Bill of Rights. So that was the compromise. Okay, we'll include a Bill of Rights if you vote to approve this Constitution. We need a strong national government. And you'll see when you watch the video on the Articles of Confederation, the biggest issue with the Articles of Confederation, which was their first constitution, was that it didn't provide enough power for the federal government and they couldn't get anything done. And the last thing that I want to talk about today is the Three-Fifths Compromise. How does this factor into what we're discussing? Well, the Three-Fifths Compromise had to get put into place because part of what the U.S. Constitution said was that the Congress, the branch that makes laws, was going to be elected, was going to be made up of representatives that were elected by the people based on population. So however many people lived in a specific state tied to how many representatives they could get in Congress. Therefore, there's this huge argument about whether or not the enslaved population counted as people for taxation and representation purposes. States in the North and South couldn't agree on how slaves would be counted. The Southern states wanted slaves to count as part of the population. Of course they did. They had a higher number of slaves, and if they were counted as people, then they got more representatives in Congress and more power in voting for national law. The Northerners believed that slaves couldn't vote, therefore they shouldn't be counted as part of the population. And so the compromise was the Three-Fifths Compromise, which is pretty messed up, but it basically says that for every 5 enslaved people, they counted as 3 white people for the sake of representation and taxation purposes. Right? So is this fair from the African American perspective? Of course not. They were being counted as kind of a person, but not kind of a person, and it was completely out of their control, and it was decided by their white owners. And so the consequence, the downside is that the Southerners got to count a portion of the enslaved population as people so that they could vote in additional representatives in Congress, but they did have to pay for that by paying taxes on those slaves as people. So their taxes went up, but they got more people counted towards a representative in Congress. So, that could equal, instead of, voting 2 people into Congress for the state of Georgia, they get to vote 4 people in because they're counting the enslaved population. And so it's a form of them getting more power, is basically what it is. The more representatives you have in Congress, the more power you have in making national or federal law. So now what? Right? The argument for a strong central government with the compromise of adding a Bill of Rights basically led to the ratification of the Constitution. All right, so in order for the Constitution to become law, national law, 2/3 of the 13 states had to ratify or approve it individually. Now they did this. They eventually ratified it or approved it, again with the compromise of the Bill of Rights, which we'll learn about in another lesson. So now we have a new Constitution. We have the separation of powers. We have the checks and balances. What did we need next? The Bill of Rights, which we'll learn about in our next lesson. So that's everything that I had for you guys today. There is a corresponding quiz with this lesson. So go ahead and take that in the next few days, and you should be in good shape. And I'll see you in another class soon.